I've always been good at making myself smaller than the room. At 29, I run the numbers for a mid-sized architecture firm, keep my apartment tidy without trying, and return every phone call within the hour. Not because anyone asks me to, but because some old part of me still believes that being easy to reach might one day be enough. I call my mother on Sundays. It's habit more than warmth, a ritual I keep out of loyalty to a version of our relationship that never quite existed. That afternoon, I'd barely finished telling her about the promotion at work when her voice brightened over something else entirely. Rachel had found a house near the lake. Wasn't that wonderful? Didn't I think the porch sounded lovely? I said yes. It did sound lovely. I always say yes to these things. It's easier than naming the small, familiar drop in my chest, the one I stopped mentioning even to myself years ago. That's just how Mom is, I told myself, folding the feeling into a shape I could carry without it showing. I had gotten so good at lowering what I expected that I started calling it maturity. Daniel noticed before I said a word about it. Not loudly. He was never loud about anything. Just a quiet stillness in his face the first time he heard me apologize for taking up too much space in a conversation, as though he'd already begun keeping count. He proposed on a Tuesday. No restaurant, no crowd, no waiting string quartet. Just the two of us in the kitchen, the pasta going cold on the stove because he'd stopped stirring it to find the words. He didn't kneel with the rehearsed speech. He just held out the ring and said he didn't want to spend one more day not making it official, that he'd known since the third month, when I apologized for crying during a sad movie, and he told me I never had to apologize for feeling things in front of him. I said yes quietly, before he even finished the sentence. It was the first time in my life I had been chosen without first proving I deserved it. No promotion to point to, no favor to call in, no version of myself I had to perform to earn it. Just me, in sweatpants, mascara still faintly smudged from a movie we'd watched 2 nights before, and he still looked at me like I was the whole reason to come home. We decided to tell my family together over dinner at the house I grew up in. Some quiet, stubborn part of me still hoped this might finally be the moment my mother looked at me the way she looked at Rachel, proud, unguarded, glad. When I called Rachel to invite her, she went quiet for half a second too long before saying, of course, she'd be there. I didn't think much of it then. The dinner started well enough. My mother was polite the way she always was, measured questions about Daniel's job, a compliment on the wine he'd brought, nothing warm enough to call kindness, but nothing cold enough to name either. I let myself relax into it, the way I always did, mistaking her composure for approval. It was Rachel who noticed first, a small nod toward the kitchen. My mother had asked Daniel to help her with something, dessert, maybe, or the coffee, and the two of them had slipped away from the table so naturally that no one else seemed to think anything of it. I didn't either. Not at first. From where I sat, I could see them through the doorway, half turned toward each other, my mother's voice too low to carry. I couldn't hear the words. I told myself she was just getting to know him, the way any mother might. I wouldn't hear the actual words until much later, in Daniel's quiet, careful retelling, the way she'd said them without raising her voice, almost gently, like a warning offered out of concern rather than cruelty. 5 words, delivered so calmly they could have passed for kindness if you didn't know better. She's not worth the trouble. That night, I only saw the aftermath. Daniel setting the coffee down a little too carefully, his jaw tightening for half a second before it smoothed itself back into politeness. He didn't say a word to her, but something in his face had already closed a door. The drive home was quiet in a way that didn't quite fit him. Daniel usually filled silences easily, commenting on nothing in particular, but that night he kept his eyes on the road a beat too long at every red light, his hand resting on the gear shift instead of finding mine. I asked if he was okay. He said he was just tired and gave my hand a small squeeze that felt more like reassurance than truth. I let it go. New meeting, new family, a mother who could make anyone feel like they were being quietly assessed. Of course he was tired. I told myself that all the way up the stairs to our apartment, and mostly I believed it. He wasn't lying to me. Not exactly. He just wasn't ready yet to hand me something he hadn't finished carrying himself. Later, after I'd fallen asleep, he lay awake replaying 5 words on a loop, turning them over like a stone he couldn't put down. She's not worth the trouble. He thought about the way I apologized for small things that needed no apology. The way I lit up, almost startled, every time he simply chose me for no reason at all. He'd assumed before that night that these were just pieces of who I was. Now he wondered how long someone has to go unchosen before gratitude starts to look like personality. He didn't wake me. He didn't say anything at all. He just lay there in the dark, and somewhere in that stillness, he decided something. He didn't sleep much that night, and by morning he still hadn't decided what to do with what he knew. Part of him wanted to bury it, to let it dissolve quietly into the ordinary noise of the week, a comment best left unrepeated. Telling me felt like handing over a weight he wasn't sure I should have to carry. But some other part of him, the part that noticed things, kept circling back to smaller moments he'd never fully registered before. The time I'd thanked him, almost sheepishly, for remembering my coffee order. The way I braced, just slightly, whenever he asked what I wanted for dinner, as if the question itself required permission. He used to think it was simply carefulness. Now he wondered if it was something learned, something practiced for so long it had stopped feeling like a choice. By the time he found me in the kitchen the next morning, he'd made peace with it. Protecting me from the truth, he realized, would only be another version of what my whole life seemed to have trained me to accept, someone deciding, on my behalf, what I could handle.
So he told me.
Not dramatically. He sat across from me, waited until I looked up from my coffee, and said it plainly, the way you'd hand someone something fragile, carefully, but without pretending it wasn't real. Your mom pulled me aside last night, he said. She told me you're not worth the trouble. He didn't soften it. He didn't need to. He just let it sit between us and waited to see what I would do with it. I set my coffee down carefully, the way you handle something when your hands aren't entirely steady. I waited for the shock to arrive. It didn't. I'm not surprised, I said, and hearing myself say it out loud was its own quiet devastation, the realization that some part of me had been braced for this my entire life, just waiting for the proof to catch up to the feeling. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I told him about the birthday dinner when I was 14, the one my mother rescheduled without asking because it conflicted with Rachel's recital. I told him about the way she introduced us at parties. My daughter Rachel, and this is Claire, as if I were an afterthought attached to someone else's sentence. I told him about 100 small moments I'd spent years explaining away, each one landing differently now that I wasn't the only one who'd heard them. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't tell me it would be okay or that my mother didn't mean it, or any of the soft, well-intentioned things people say to make discomfort end faster. He just sat with me in it, steady, letting the words exist without trying to fix them. Somewhere in the telling, something in me settled, not healed, just settled, like a decision quietly locking into place. I would not spend my wedding waiting for her approval. I wasn't sure yet I'd spend the rest of my life waiting for it either. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand, waiting until I looked at him before he spoke. Your worth was never hers to decide, he said. It was never anyone's to decide but yours. And I don't want to wait another 6 months planning a day just to prove that to people who already made up their minds about you before I ever walked in the door. I searched his face for anger, for some trace of spite dressed up as romance. There wasn't any, just the same steadiness he'd carried since the day I met him. Marry me this weekend, he said. Just us. A courthouse, a witness, nothing borrowed from anyone else's expectations. For a moment I hesitated, not because I doubted him, but because some old, tired part of me still flinched at the thought of my family finding out I hadn't waited, hadn't asked, hadn't given them the chance to make it about them. Then I thought about the dinner. The kitchen doorway. 5 words spoken so calmly, they'd almost sounded like care. Okay, I said, and felt something unclench in my chest as I said it. We spent the rest of that evening on the phone, my closest friend from college laughing in disbelief before agreeing to be our witness, Daniel's brother clearing his Saturday without a single question asked. No caterers, no dress fittings, no seating charts. Just two people deciding, together, that Saturday couldn't come soon enough. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, nothing like the venues I used to circle in bridal magazines as a teenager. There were no flowers, no string quartet, no rows of chairs waiting to be filled with people weighing whether I deserved the moment. Just a small waiting room with fluorescent lighting, two folding chairs, and a clerk who'd clearly done this 1,000 times before and still smiled like it mattered. My college friend stood on one side with her phone camera shaking slightly from happy nerves. Daniel's brother stood on the other, grinning the whole way through, as if he'd known all along this day would come faster than anyone expected. Daniel took my hands, and when he said his vows, his voice didn't waver once. I looked around that plain little room, mismatched chairs, secondhand witnesses, no decor besides the late afternoon light through the blinds, and felt something I couldn't remember feeling at any holiday table, any birthday dinner, any family gathering dressed up to look like belonging. I felt fully, unmistakably chosen. My phone sat face down on the chair beside me through the entire ceremony. I hadn't planned that. I just hadn't been able to look at it, hadn't wanted whatever might be waiting there to touch this hour. Afterward, walking out into the parking lot as Daniel's wife, I finally turned it over. One missed call. Rachel. The news, it seemed, had already started finding its way home. I called Rachel back that evening, still wearing the plain white dress I'd bought 2 days earlier off a rack. No alterations, no time for any. She picked up on the first ring, her voice pulled tight in a way I recognized immediately. The sound of someone caught between two people she didn't want to disappoint. "You got married," she said. Not a question. Mom knows. I waited for the explosion I'd half expected my whole life. The one I'd learned to brace for as a kid whenever I did something outside the lines drawn for me. It didn't come. What came instead was worse, in its own quiet way. Rachel described our mother's reaction not as anger, but as something colder, a long silence on the phone, a flat "I see," the particular stillness Linda reserved for moments she considered beneath a reaction at all. "She's disappointed," Rachel said carefully, "the way you'd hand someone something you didn't want to be holding either." I felt the old reflex rise in my throat, the apology, the explanation, the offer to make it right, to smooth the edges before anyone had to feel anything uncomfortable for too long. I didn't say it. For the first time in my life, I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it. "She wants everyone together," Rachel finally said. "This weekend. To talk." I told her we'd be there. Not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because some things I was starting to understand couldn't stay buried in a phone call. They needed a room. They needed a table. They needed to finally be said out loud. Rachel showed up at my apartment the day before the family dinner, unannounced, holding 2 coffees she hadn't asked if I wanted. She set one down in front of me and stood there for a moment before finally sitting, like she needed the extra second to decide whether she was actually going to say what she'd come to say. "I always knew," she said quietly, "that it wasn't fair, how she was with you versus how she was with me."
I didn't say anything.
I'd waited a long time to hear this, and I didn't want to rush her out of finally saying it. "I never said anything because," she stopped, turned her cup slowly on the table, "because it felt like if I pointed it out, I'd lose my spot too. Like there wasn't room for both of us to be loved right." It wasn't an excuse. I could tell she knew that, but it was honest in a way we'd never managed to be with each other before. Then she said something else, almost to herself, like it had slipped out before she could stop it. She used to say you looked too much like him, like Dad. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. More than once. I sat with that for a long moment, something shifting quietly into place. Maybe this had never really been about me at all. Rachel reached over and took my hand. Neither of us said it was enough, but for the first time in years, it was real. Rachel told me the rest slowly, Piecing it together from fragments she'd collected over years of half-heard conversations and things our aunt had let slip at holidays when the wine went around one too many times. Our father had adored me as a child. Not in the ordinary way parents adore their kids, but visibly, openly, carrying me on his shoulders at family gatherings while Rachel trailed behind, requesting my drawings for his office walls, laughing longest at things I said. Our mother had noticed all of it, every time, standing slightly outside the circle of his attention, watching the daughter, who looked like her, get overlooked in favor of the one who apparently looked like him.
Then he left.
17 years ago, no warning anyone ever fully explained, just gone, leaving my mother alone with 2 daughters and no acceptable place to put the wreckage of what he'd done to her. She couldn't rage at a man who wasn't there to receive it. So somewhere in the years that followed, without ever naming it, even to herself, that grief found somewhere else to live. In my face, in my gestures, in whatever it was about me that still carried pieces of him. Her warning to Daniel wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more twisted and more human, a woman so certain that love like that always leaves. She'd rather warn someone away from it than watch him discover it for himself. I had spent my entire life being punished for choices that were never mine to carry. The house looked the same as it always had, same worn armchair, same clock ticking too loudly in the hallway, but the air felt different this time, thick with everything no one had ever said out loud. Daniel stood beside me, close enough that I could feel his steadiness without needing to lean on it.
He didn't speak.
He didn't need to. He was simply there, letting this be mine to carry. My mother sat across the room, composed as always, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a meeting to begin rather than a reckoning. "Why did you say that to him?" I asked. No preamble, no softening. "Why did you tell Daniel I wasn't worth the trouble?" For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, the barest crack in a surface she'd spent 17 years perfecting. "I was trying to protect you," she said, too quickly, the words sounding rehearsed even to her. Protect me from what? Her jaw tightened. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its usual control. "You don't know what it's like. Watching someone love you the way your father loved you. Watching them look at you like that," and then she stopped herself, but not soon enough. The room went silent. Rachel stared at the floor. My mother's hands had begun to tremble slightly in her lap, and for the first time in my life, I watched her search for words that didn't come. My mother found me in the kitchen later, after Rachel had ushered everyone else out onto the porch to give us room. She stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, the way you'd approach something you weren't sure would let you get close. "I never gave you a fair chance to just be you," she said. It wasn't quite an apology. It was something smaller, more tentative, like she was testing whether the words could survive being spoken aloud. I waited. I didn't fill the silence for her, didn't offer the reassurance I used to hand out automatically, the easy "it's okay" that had smoothed over so many moments like this one before. This time, I let the discomfort sit there, unclaimed, exactly as heavy as it actually was. "I'm not saying it was right," she continued, and I could hear her reaching for footing she didn't fully have. "I'm just saying, every time I looked at you, some part of me was still standing in that kitchen the night he told me he was leaving. And I know that's not fair to you. I know it never was." Her hands, folded tightly in front of her, had started to tremble again. "I don't know how to undo 17 years, she said, quieter now. "I don't know if I even fully understood I was doing it until this week. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to enough on its own. But it was the first unguarded thing she had said to me in longer than I could remember, and something in her voice, for just a moment, sounded almost like grief for the daughter she hadn't let herself have. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had spent 17 years mistaking me for someone else's absence. "I love you," I said, and meant it, even now. "But I'm not going to keep making myself smaller, so this family feels comfortable. I've been doing that my whole life, and I don't have it in me anymore." She started to speak, but I wasn't finished. I'm not asking you to fix everything today. I don't think that's even possible. But if we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, it has to be honest. No more pretending things are fine when they're not. No more comparing me to Rachel, or to him, or to anyone I'm not.
Just me.
Whoever that turns out to be to you. She didn't reach for me. She didn't cry or promise to change or offer the kind of tidy resolution that would have made the moment easier to walk away from. But she was quiet in a different way than before, not the practiced stillness she wore like armor, but something closer to actually listening, maybe for the first time in either of our lives. Okay, she finally said.
Just that.
No more, no less. But it was honest, and lately I'd learned that honest was worth more than easy. I left the kitchen without waiting for anything further. My chest felt lighter than it had in years, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally said out loud exactly what I needed to. Rachel was waiting on the porch steps when I came out, elbows on her knees, staring out at nothing in particular. She scooted over to make room without being asked. "I'm sorry," she said, before I'd even sat down. "Not for what Mom did. I can't apologize for that, but for staying quiet all those years, for letting it be easier." I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't, not entirely, but I told her I understood that survival inside a family like ours sometimes meant not rocking the only boat you had. She nodded, and for a while we just sat there together, not needing to fill the silence with anything performative. It wasn't a fixed relationship. It was something better, maybe an honest one still finding its shape. In the weeks that followed, small things shifted. My mother texted before calling now, instead of assuming I'd pick up. She asked about Daniel by name, not just as your husband, and once, awkwardly, invited us both to Sunday dinner without Rachel having to broker it first. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was effort, clumsy and unfamiliar, from a woman relearning a language she'd never let herself speak. I stopped waiting for it to look like Rachel's version of belonging. I let it be its own thing, imperfect, still forming, not equal to what I'd once hoped for as a kid at that dinner table. I didn't need everyone to change at the same pace anymore. I just needed to stop needing them to. Some nights, Daniel and I still talk about that weekend. The folding chairs, the fluorescent lighting, the marriage certificate we picked up almost as an afterthought on our way out the door. We laugh about it now, the strangeness of how something so small ended up holding so much weight. But underneath the laughing, we both know what it really was. Not a rebellion, not a reaction to anger, just two people refusing to let someone else's fear decide what we were allowed to have. I understand my mother differently now than I did that night at the dinner table. Her words were never a verdict on who I was. They were a reflection of a grief she never let herself name, a wound she handed to me because she didn't know where else to put it. That doesn't erase what it cost me, growing up in the shadow of it. But it does mean I get to stop carrying it as truth. Our life now isn't dramatic. It's ordinary in the best way, grocery runs, quiet mornings, a marriage built without an audience, and somehow sturdier for it. My mother comes to dinner sometimes. Rachel calls just to talk, no occasion required. None of it is perfect. All of it is real. I spent so many years waiting for someone to tell me I was worth the trouble. Turns out I never needed the verdict. I just needed to stop waiting for permission to already know the answer.